my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Pearson, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, specializing in American politics. How appropriate that we have that on Election Day. Professor Pearson received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and in 2002 and 2003, she was a research fellow at the Brookings Institute. She's been the winner of the Congressional Quarterly Press Award for the best paper on legislative studies presented at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association in 2001 and 2007. And Pearson is a recipient of the Morse Alumni Undergraduate Teaching Award in 2012 for outstanding contributions to undergraduate education. In 2015, she published the book Party Discipline in the House of Representatives, issued by the University of Michigan Press. I'll also point out, and this is how I've become familiar with her, that Professor Pearson appears frequently on Almanac, which airs on Friday night on Twin Cities Public Television. And she's going to provide us with a presentation, Partisan Politics, Partisan Polarization in Contemporary American Politics. Kathryn?
Great, thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be part of this seminar series. And my focus today is on the red and blue divide, or partisan polarization in the United States, the divide between the two major parties in the mass public and in the electorate and in our institutions. And throughout the next hour, I want to make three key points about American politics today. The first is that how we view the American electorate, and specifically the red and blue divide, is connected to institutional rules that shape both behavior and outcomes. The second is that America is narrowly divided between the two parties, with nearly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, and many fewer independents than the media would lead you to believe. And three, in many respects, America is deeply divided today, more divided than it's been in over 100 years. The two parties are farther apart when it comes to policy and when it comes to civility than they have been in over a century. But having said that, partisan polarization did not begin during the Trump era. It has been building since the 1970s, which I will focus on as well. So drawing on the theme of aesthetics and how we view politics and partisan divides, I want to start by showing you some maps that represent the partisan divide in American politics. Then I'll present some research on public opinion, and then congressional behavior to provide some deeper context, and finally conclude with brief remarks on what political science tells us about the 2020 election cycle coming up, fewer than 365 days from now. You are no doubt familiar with these type of electoral college maps that we see every election night, every 4 years. The red and blue states that appear, and they've been a staple of American politics coverage on election night since 2000. The red and the blue divide, as it is seen by the mass public, politicians, and the media alike, is sort of an important feature of American politics. But interestingly, it's really only been in place since 2000. As recently as 1996, one TV station had Democrats in red, another in blue, and it was sort of a hodgepodge of different colors that weren't necessarily related to this red-blue divide. But in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore in 2000, the parties the networks agreed, and everyone coalesced around red for Republicans and blue for Democrats, and they've really become a staple of American politics ever since. So this map shows the red and blue states and their electoral college votes. The founders proposed what has come to be known as the Electoral College in an effort to mix state, congressional, and popular participation in the presidential selection process. As stipulated in Article 2 of the Constitution, the number of electoral votes that each state has is equal to the number of representatives and senators that each state has in Congress. And the Constitution left it to states to choose electors who would then deliberate and choose a trusted candidate. Well, that's not what happens today. Today, we are left with a constitutional framework that has important consequences in presidential elections. This map shows the number of electors by state. Minnesota, of course, has 10 for its 8 representatives and 2 senators. And no state, however small its population, has fewer than 3 electoral college votes. The 23rd Amendment added DC. Big states are underrepresented in the Electoral College because of Senate malapportionment. A voter in California has 1 elector for every 617,000 residents, while a voter in Wyoming has 1 elector for every 100,000 residents. To win, as you know, a candidate needs 270 out of 538 electoral votes. And if it's a 269 to 269 tie, the decision goes to the House of Representatives, with each state, not each member, having 1 vote. So American presidential elections are not decided directly by national popular vote. 48 states cast all of their electoral votes for the candidate who receives the most popular votes in that state, no matter what the margin. In this winner-take-all system, or loser-take-nothing, a candidate can come very close in a state but get no electoral votes. This also means that during a campaign, swing states get the lion's share of attention. They get presidential visits, they get presidential ads, they get a field staff, they get out the vote efforts. And what political science research has shown, that this has effects on political learning. So voters in swing states like Ohio and Florida that perpetually get the most attention and the most visits and the most ads, those voters, especially low SES voters, tend to be the most knowledgeable and the most likely to vote among other states. We also know that from a policy perspective, presidents tend to give those states more policy attention as well. So it has real life consequences. Here's the 2016 Electoral College Map. The states that Trump carried are red, the states that Clinton carried are blue. And this map and those that follow were designed by Mark Newman from the Department of Physics at the University of Michigan. And this map, of course, looks much more red than blue. But as you know, Hillary Clinton got about 3 million more popular votes than Trump, making it the second time since 2000 that the winner of the election was not the popular vote winner. So here's a cartogram of the same results, a map in which the sizes of states are rescaled according to their population. States with more people appear larger than states with fewer, regardless of their actual area on the ground. On such a map, for example, on this map, for example, the state of Rhode Island, with its 1.1 million residents, appears about twice the size of Wyoming, which has 500,000, even though Wyoming has 60 times the acreage that Rhode Island does. As I mentioned, the Electoral College decides elections, and all but 2 states do winner-take-all. And because of this bias toward less populous states, Newman also has a cartogram that represents the effects of the Electoral College by scaling the sizes of states to be proportional to their number of electoral votes, which produces this map. And this looks very similar to the previous one, but it's different in that states like Wyoming has doubled in size because of the bias in favor of states with smaller populations. So now the areas of red and blue on the map are proportional to the actual number of electors won by each candidate. Here are the county level election results. Of course, the votes aren't tallied by county, but this gives you an even more striking image. It looks like red sort of has overwhelmed blue in terms of this map. The effects that we saw at the state level are even more pronounced, with the red areas appearing to be in the majority despite the closeness of the vote, and in fact, the margin of popular vote victory for Clinton. And once again, here's a cartogram of county level votes, making it this mishmash sort of more illustrative of the actual vote distribution, but it's still misleading because every county is either red or blue as opposed to representing the actual vote share in each county. So the next 2 maps will be maps that take into account this vote share. This first one, by Blue Shift, actually just shows in a 3D scaled way how much the urban areas went for Clinton. You can see Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, even Minneapolis, the Twin Cities area sort of popping up as real outliers. And then finally, the map that I started with, using the shades of purple in between to indicate the percentages of votes. And so here's what the county level map looks like with votes shaded. And so this is probably, even though it's not a cartogram, a more accurate description of the population. But this is not the view that Americans get on election day. Americans are given red versus blue, and in fact, politicians have very much internalized red versus blue. That's why when President Obama, when President Obama was then a state senator representing a Senate district in Illinois, and his first big moment on stage in 2004 at the Democratic National Convention, he gained a lot of attention for these words. He said in 2004, "The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states. Red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states." Fast forward to his speech in 2008, the night that he won, and he said, Americans just sent a message to the world that we have never been just a collection of individuals or a collection of red states and blue states. We are and always will be the United States of America. Nonetheless, here we are in 2019, and politicians, the media, and the mass public continue to view the country in red and blue terms. And that coincides with changes in the American electorate that I will begin to detail. The mass public is narrowly divided between the two parties, and it is more deeply divided in the past. And these divisions and the closeness between the two parties produce a lot of incentives for our elected leaders to respond to their partisan bases and to compete with one another rather than to compromise. I'll talk about our institutions in just a few minutes, but I really want to start with a deeper dive into the mass public. So these data presented by the Pew Research Center show the relatively even divide between the two parties since 1994. Polarization predates 1994, but this gives us a pretty good window. And although the numbers fluctuate, you can see that in general, the two parties are relatively evenly divided. At times, one party may have an edge over the other, but they're relatively even. And this stability has produced uncertainty in elections that has given politicians incentives to compete with the other party rather than to compromise. This has manifested itself in fundraising, but in part it comes from this distribution in the mass public. Since 1980, it's been pretty clear in the US Senate that either party could be in the majority. And since 1994, when Republicans took control of the US House for the first time in 40 years, it's been pretty clear that either party could be in the majority in the House. And so this close partisan divide has led to a lot of competition. One thing to notice about this figure, it suggests that back in 1994, independents comprised 33% of the electorate. By 2018, independents comprised 38% of the electorate. And according to political science research, this just isn't true. Political scientists really only consider independents to be this gray line in the middle, this 7% of the electorate that in 2018 continued to insist that they were an independent when a survey researcher asked, generally speaking, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or what? If someone says a Republican or a Democrat, they're asked, do you consider yourself a strong Democrat? If they say yes, they're a strong Democrat. If they say no, they're a weak Democrat. But if they initially say, I'm an independent, then the survey researcher will say, do you lean toward one party or the other? And most respondents will say that they lean toward one party or the other. That group in the middle, that 7% in the gray area in 2018, that is the group that will continue to say, I consider myself an independent. Well, political science research shows that those partisan leaners, those people who initially identify as independents, but then on the follow-up question indicate that they lean toward one party or the other, they vote more consistently for the party that they lean to than those who initially answer as a partisan, but then say that they're a weak partisan. So these independent leaners really are partisans. They vote, and they vote for the party that they lean to in election after election. So in the next year, when you see surveys that suggest that 33% of the electorate is comprised of independents, you now know that that is not accurate. What you want to know is what percent are independent leaners and what percent are pure independents. The other thing about pure independents is, and I'm always challenged by people who are like, no, we're very discerning. No, pure independents are those people who are much less likely to follow politics at all. So they're less likely to vote, they're less likely to be able to name either candidate, and they're just people who just really don't care that much about politics. And so, this notion that we've got a third of the electorate as discerning independents just does not comport with the empirical reality. Now that said, that doesn't mean that in a close election, those pure independents who aren't paying much attention until election day don't have a big impact. They do, or they can, depending on the closeness of the election. One other point about these independent leaners, also data that come from Pew. Most independents who lean to a party cite the harm of the opposing party's policy. So those Republican leaners are saying that Democrats' policies, 58% of them are saying that the Democrats' party policies are bad for the country. 57% of Democratic leaners are saying that. And then they also will say that their own party's policies are good for the country, but they're even more likely to criticize the other party's policies. They say they have not much in common with the other party, although only 29 or 30% of them. But then they're not saying that they have a lot in common with their own party. And this gets to a broader phenomenon that political scientists have observed in recent years called negative partisanship. So negative partisanship refers to the fact that individuals tend to dislike the other party even more than they like their own party. So they'll be incentivized to cast a vote because they dislike the other party so much, not because they're particularly enthusiastic about their own. So this is a pretty depressing picture of American politics in 2019, but it really is where the data and the research done by political scientists sort of suggests that we are, where we were in the 2016 election and where we've continued to be. At the same time, just as Congress has become much more polarized, and I'll detail that in a few minutes, the American electorate has become more polarized as well. When I first started doing political science, we used to think of sort of the two parties that are elected to office as being sort of a bipolar distribution with a bell curve of the American electorate. But that's really changed to more of a bipolar distribution in the American electorate as well. Since 1994, as these data from Pew suggest, more Democrats take liberal positions today than in the past, and more Republicans take conservative ones. And so if you look to 1994, only 5% of Democrats were consistently liberal. Compare that to 27% by 2015. Most of Republicans are either mostly conservative or consistently conservative as well. And even though this isn't as polarized as members of Congress or the state legislature, the politically active and engaged, those most likely to donate, those most likely to participate in primaries, those that individual elected members of Congress are most likely to hear from, are more consistently liberal on the left and more consistently conservative on the right. And this figure really details that as well. This shows, for example, that in 1994, 64% of Republicans were more conservative ideologically than the median Democrat. By 2017, that number had increased to 95% of Republicans being more conservative than the median Democrats. The numbers are similar for Democrats, with 70% of Democrats in 1994 being more liberal than the median Republican, and 97% of Democrats by 2017 identifying as more liberal than the median Republican. So in the mass public, the two parties, at least those who were attentive, have really polarized. And that also means that when they go to the polls, voters are more likely to see a difference. When Ralph Nader ran for president in 2000, and as a third-party candidate did play a pivotal role in a very, very close election, some research should suggest a decisive role, many of his supporters suggested that there were not a lot of differences between Bush and Gore. But if you look at ANES responses, the American National Election Study collected every 2 years by political scientists, you can see that a growing majority of voters see important differences between the two parties. Now, I will say there are important differences between the two parties if you look at their party platforms, but whether or not voters perceive them is sort of another question. And incidentally, if you look at their party platforms, the important differences that exist between them, as measured by political scientists, have also gone up over time. More on negative partisanship. Most Americans feel favorably toward one party and unfavorably toward the others. Toward the other, and once again, these numbers are growing, so that 12% by 2018 feel unfavorable toward both parties, 17% are favorable to both parties, and 66% are favorable to one and unfavorable to another. So parties are not very popular in the American electorate, but this does not mean that parties are about to die. If anything, parties are as strong in some respects as they have been in a long time. Most Americans identify with the party, and among those who do identify or lean toward a party, 9 out of 10 of them vote for their party's candidates in elections. The other result is that split ticket voting is way down. This shows split ticket voting from 1952 to 2016, with the purple and pink lines at the bottom showing split ticket voting, whether voting shown by purple for a Republican president and Democratic member of Congress, or Republican president, and a Democratic president and a Republican member of Congress. And so when people did defect from their party, especially at the beginning of this time series, it was typically toward the incumbent member of Congress. And so for many years, especially in the South, there were voters who were voting for Republican presidential party candidates and Democratic incumbents. And that began to change in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with implications not just for split ticket voting, but implications inside the institution, which I'll get to in a minute. And so the bottom line is people are less likely to split their ticket. This whole notion of balancing by voting for one party's candidate for one office and another party's candidate for another really is just not done much. And in fact, analyses of the incumbency advantage have shown that even though incumbents win re-election to the House of Representatives around 95% of the time, it is not because of an incumbency advantage. It is because the vast majority of members of Congress today represent congressional districts that favor their party. So there are only about 3 dozen or so members of Congress who currently represent a congressional district that didn't vote for their party's, for the same party's presidential candidate. And of course, those members of Congress are vulnerable and cross-pressured, but most members of Congress enjoy relative safety because their district favors their party when they elect members of Congress and the president. So before I turn to partisan polarization inside Congress, I want to briefly touch on the 2018 midterm elections, sort of that happened about a year ago. And as you all know, all 435 US House seats were up, and Democrats gained 40 seats. And they only needed 25 to take majority party control of the House, and so they did so with a cushion. But given what political scientists know about midterm elections, it was not surprising that Democrats picked up seats. It was surprising that they picked up so many seats, but it was not surprising. Because midterm elections are different in some very important ways than presidential elections. In midterm elections since 1862, the president's party has averaged losses of about 32 seats in the House. In only 3 elections in the last century has the president's party actually gained seats in the House during a midterm election. And that was 1934, 1998, and 2002. In 2002, of course, Republicans were very popular, both at the presidential level and then running for re-election in the House in the wake of September 11th. And then in 1998, Democrats actually gained seats, despite the fact that Bill Clinton was president, because his popularity surged during impeachment. And so I think many Democrats are sort of remembering this as perhaps a cautionary tale. So in the 2018 midterm elections, Republicans also gained 2 seats in the Senate. So the fact that in general, even though the president's party tends to also lose seats in the Senate was structurally favored Republicans because of which candidates were up for re-election. Interestingly, because of the state of the economy, the political science election models predicted that Republicans would fare much better in 2018 than they actually did. And so presidential approval also clearly depressed the results for Democrats. And although there was about 20% lower turnout in midterm elections in general than presidential elections, turnout was in many states record high for a midterm in 2018. But the 2018 midterms really sort of further polarized each party's caucus. So in the current 116th Congress, this is a map drawn by population of the 435 congressional districts. You can see in shaded blue are the seats that flipped from red to blue, and in shaded red are the states that flipped from blue to red. And in the 116th Congress, as a result of these elections, House Democrats represent 79% of all Asian Americans, 72% of Latinx Americans, 66% of African Americans, 60% of college graduates, 45% of white Americans, 39% of Trump voters, and 20% of America's land area. So you can see real geographic and demographic differences in the 2 constituencies that the 2 parties represent in Congress, which helps to explain some of this deep polarization. Because I'm standing here in Minnesota, I just have to note that Minnesota sort of is the most interesting state in the 2018 elections because 4 of its House seats switched parties for a net change of 0, making it sort of the most change with the least impact in the US. So the 1st district and the 8th district switched from Democrat to Republican, and the 2nd district and the 3rd district switched from Republican to Democrat. And I was talking to a Washington Post reporter about this, and he kept wanting me to look at this map to point out where all the change from the 2016 presidential vote to 2018 House vote was. And I was like, there is no change. That's the whole point. 2018 now aligns with the 2016 presidential vote. In Minnesota's 3rd district, which is to say that the incumbency advantage sort of no longer worked in Minnesota's 3rd district, which went for Clinton by a big margin in 2016 and then did the same at the House level 2 years later in 2018. And that dynamic was repeated in many suburban, affluent, well-educated districts across the country. As you can see. So this graphic is from the Washington Post, and it shows how Democrats gain seats in the suburbs. Once again, the dark blue are the seats that flipped. The dark red are the seats, Democrat, the dark red are the seats that flipped Republican. And the figure goes from left to right in terms of most sparsely populated to most densely populated. So if you look at rural districts, they're overwhelmingly Republican, rural suburban, same thing. Sparse suburban, a little more mixed, and then dense suburban, and urban, overwhelmingly Democratic. And that's where some of those flips were. So one question is whether or not that will hold in 2020, but certainly shows you some of the changing demographics of the country. The next slide from the New York Times perhaps surprises people even more, because this shows both that Democrats gain seats and more affluent districts, and that Democrats essentially represent all the wealthiest districts. If you look at districts where the median income is more than $100,000, there were some seats that flipped to Democratic, and then the others remain constant. And so, once again, these give you a sense of the real constituency differences that help to drive some of the polarization that we're seeing in politics today. This is also reflected to some extent in vote choice in the 2018 midterms. These figures come from the respondents from the national election polls taken of voters that are pooled together by the media across the country with 18,778 respondents. And this just shows the change. Well, this doesn't show the change. This shows how overwhelmingly college graduates voted for Democratic House candidates in 2018, and that those who were not a college graduate in 2018 were evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. For a point of context, Hillary Clinton won voters with college degrees by a margin of 52 to 43% in 2016, and Trump won votes of those without college degrees by 8 points in 2016. President Obama, back in 2012, won both groups. So things have really shifted in 2018. Local politics were nationalized in 2018. A majority of voters in House elections, when the president was not on the ballot, either said their vote for the US House today was to support Trump or to oppose Trump, with Trump not being a factor for only 33% of voters, according to exit polls. And so, once again, midterm election results are less a referendum on individual incumbents and more a referendum on the president in the president's party. So one more point about 2018 before I move on to polarization in Congress is the importance of gender dynamics in 2018. Sort of we think about 2016 as a historic election for women, but really 2018 is the election where women really made a difference on the Democratic side. There were 476 women running for the US House and 53 running for the US Senate, which was a record number in both categories. And while extensive political science research has shown that women typically win elections at the same rate as men, so that the dearth of women is caused by sort of women not running for office, not by women being more likely to win, women actually won their primaries at higher rates than men did. And 36 new women were elected to the House for a record total of 102 women, only 13 of them Republicans, and then 25 women serve in the US Senate. But there was a huge partisan gap. Women were 43% of Democrats' nominees for the US Senate and for the US House, while women were only 22% of Republicans' nominees for the Senate and 13% for the House. So some pretty massive partisan differences when it comes to gender. What this meant for the first-term Democrats and first-term Republicans was a bigger class for first-term Democrats with many more women and many more people of color. So this current Congress, the percentage of white men as a share of the House Democratic caucus is 38% after the 2018 elections and the 116th Congress, but the percentage of white men as a share of House Republicans rose from 86% to 90%. So the two parties are constituted very differently. Which brings me to sort of the section of this talk on partisanship in the US Congress, which I have spent extensive time studying and will try not to go on and on about. But this picture with Speaker Pelosi and President Trump giving the State of the Union sort of sums up their relationship, I think. And the relationship probably between Democrats and Republicans more generally. So parties in Congress today are very strong and very polarized. This has not always been the case, and it is a far cry from the textbook Congress that I learned about in middle school, where bills are referred to committees and committee chairs are in charge, and if a committee marks up a bill and sends it to the floor, well, there it goes. That's not how Congress works today, and it's not how it's worked for a while, but the strength and the polarization of parties has been growing since the 1970s, and means that majority party leaders in the House really set the agenda, decide what bills come to the floor, what members get their bills heard, what committees members serve on, and they have a lot of power over legislation and a lot of power over the fate of their members. And this began as a series of reforms in the 1970s, when the Democratic caucus was really split between about a third of conservative Southern Democrats who opposed civil rights, who opposed liberal labor legislation, and more liberal Democratic members elected in 1968, elected in 1962, who really wanted to enact a lot of reforms. So with a series of reforms in the early to mid 1970s, Democrats voted to give party leaders a lot more power and to take power away from committee chairs. They also gave rank and file members a little bit more power. That didn't totally last. But what it has meant for today is that while committee chairs still have the power to hold hearings and mark up legislation, they are much more beholden to party leaders than committee chairs in the past. And it also means that individual members are much more beholden to party leaders than they were in the past. And some of the friction that we saw in the last Republican-controlled Congresses with Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, who, despite their legislative skills, did not do so well as speakers, they were really frustrated by very conservative factions within the Republican Party, where members were upset that rank-and-file members didn't have more power. And Speaker Pelosi is beginning to see some of this as well. But in general, for several decades, members of each party have been willing to cede their party leaders a lot of power so that the majority party can pass a partisan agenda, so that they don't need bipartisan cooperation, so that with 218 votes, the majority party can do what it wants. And what that also means is that members of Congress vote together a lot. These data come from Congressional Quarterly Weekly, and they show from 1956 to the present, in both the House on top and the Senate on the bottom, Democrats, of course, in blue, Republicans, of course, in red, the members' average party unity, or their average voting with the majority of their party on items that are important to their party. So, for example, in 2017, the average party loyalty score among Democrats was 93%. So, on average, members voted with their party 93% of the time on important bills to the party. And then, Republicans are opposing Democrats by the same amount, and vice versa. So the numbers fluctuate a little bit, but they go down to the 50s in the Senate and the 60s in the House in some of the earlier decades. But as members become more like-minded, as party leaders gain more power, and as members are more likely to represent districts that are comprised of a majority of their partisans, they're much more likely to vote with their party. And so that's sort of where we are today, with members of Congress sort of very likely to vote with their party. So the best predictor of a member of Congress's vote is always going to be, what's their party? Occasionally, other things matter at the margins, but less and less so. This is another visual of the House of Representatives that I took from the higherlearning.com when it used to compromise. And so the blue, of course, are the Democratic members and the red are the Republican members, but they're displayed ideologically from left to right. So you can see that there used to be a lot more crossover among members of Congress than there is today, or than there was by 2011, with very few Republicans voting with Democrats and vice versa. This dynamic is also repeated when it comes to presidential support. So President Trump, in his first 2 years of office, actually led the way in terms of support from his own party's members of Congress, not from the other parties, but in terms of his own, with the members of his own party supporting him sort of on average 93.4% of the time. Now, it is also true, though, that President Trump did not actually pursue a particularly large policy agenda. Deregulation and then tax cuts and sort of tax changes to the tax code were his big high-ticket items, but he didn't take a stand on as many items as first-term presidents typically do, especially when their party controls both chambers of Congress. And of course, once we see these numbers for Congress, which is today divided along party lines with the Democratic House and Republican Senate, the numbers will look much different because he doesn't have the majority in the House of Representatives. So Speaker Pelosi is in an interesting position. It is unusual for, well, she's the only woman speaker. She's emerged after defeat to come back and be reelected as Speaker after Democrats lost the House, and by a lot, what President Obama referred to as a shellacking, in 2010, losing more than 60 seats. So typically, when a Speaker's party loses the majority, the Speaker is done. The Speaker retires, the Speaker is done. But that was not the case with Pelosi. So some members of Congress sort of didn't want her, or some Democrats did not want her to be minority leader after that. But she didn't face real credible challengers. She faced some challengers, but not particularly strong challengers. And so she survived in the intervening years as House Minority Leader. And in that time, she continued to raise record-setting sums of money for Democratic candidates around the country. And she continued to be sort of a strategic force within the Democratic Party. She's not on the Sunday shows that often. She's not a particularly dynamic speaker, but in terms of articulating the party's message, but she remained popular with many, but not all, of her members. But as 2018 ramped up and many Republicans were using pictures of moderate Democrats challenging them next to, liberal San Francisco values Nancy Pelosi, a lot of people predicted, there's no way she'll be Speaker again. But she counted votes and she persuaded sort of Democrat after Democrat, even giving some committee assignments and a committee chairmanship. And she once again was elected Speaker for the 116th Congress. And she faces more challenges in this Congress from liberal Democrats than from moderate Democrats. So during her years as Speaker, the 2 years when she was Speaker when Obama was first president and the 2 years prior when Bush was president, her biggest challenges were from the blue dogs, the more moderate Democrats who thought she was too liberal. But interestingly, in 2019, her biggest challenges are from the left, from new members like AOC and other members who think that, as newly elected liberal members, they don't have enough power. And so this dynamic whereby Democrats, beginning in the 1970s, wanted to take power away from Southern conservatives to pass a more liberal agenda is sort of coming back to haunt Democrats as party leaders have so much power that it means that their more liberal flank does not have as much power as they would like. So Democrats are really facing sort of a divide both in the electorate with the nominating contest and in Congress over how to appease sort of different factions of the Democratic Party, just as Republicans did in the last two Congresses, with Speaker Boehner having to resign because of pressure from more conservative members, and then Speaker Paul Ryan leaving after serving such a short time as Speaker himself, as a relatively young man. But then it also reflects the challenges of dealing with President Trump. Of course, Speaker Pelosi for a long time really said no to impeachment, and only recently, in the aftermath of the whistleblower, did she sort of relent, although ironically, the committee chairs were sort of doing investigations all along. But impeachment is not the topic today. Okay, so another point about Congress, just to illustrate just how much power party leaders have and how much that shuts out rank and file members, is this shows 4 decades of rising limitations on floor participation in the US House. And it maps the percentage of what are called restrictive rules that govern debate on the House floor. So every major bill that is considered on the House floor needs a rule for its consideration. Every rule is voted on separately. And in the era of strong committee chairs, any member of Congress could offer an amendment as long as it was germane to a bill that came up on the House floor. But as party leaders have had more power, they are more likely to instruct the Rules Committee, which they control since the 70s, to have a restrictive rule and not allow any member of Congress to offer an amendment, because they don't want to change the underlying bill to be more moderate, or in some cases more liberal, because they want to make sure, what the party leaders prefer is what's passed. And so this just maps the rise in restrictive rules over time. Republican speakers or leaders are in red, of course, Democrats in blue, Pelosi is no exception. In fact, you can see during the blue era when she was first speaker, leads the way, and all the data are not in, obviously, for this first term of the 116th Congress, but the rules are pretty much all restrictive. And so this leads to more generally a certain level of congressional dysfunction that is related but separate than polarization. For the last decade, more than a decade, we've had late appropriation bills, shutdown threats, and actual government shutdowns, a breakdown of regular order where members can't offer amendments to bills, and members of Congress don't even have the requisite amount of time to read a bill before they have to vote on it, a decline of committees, fewer meetings, fewer markups, fewer hearings, and a dramatic decline in committee power, a high staff turnover, partisan polarization, and then a lack of responsiveness to the most important problems. If you were to map public opinion surveys on the most pressing concerns of the American electorate, those are not the issues that Congress is actually delving into. And so there's a lot going on in Congress that needs reform. And Congress recently formed a select committee on congressional reform, where they're hearing both from members of Congress, reform groups. I'm on a task force of political scientists that has presented a report to this group to try to improve Congress. But polarization is sort of deeply intertwined with the dysfunction in Congress. And this dysfunction did not start in 2017, nor will it end, no matter what happens, after 2020. But it's pretty clear that Congress needs to do something to reassert its own power in our separation of power system. So even as initially it seemed like strong parties were the answer to Congress reasserting itself, sort of the glue of this collective action problem, it's now pretty clear that they've been part of the problem. Just as a side note, in the 1950s, the last political science task force that dealt with Congress recommended that parties get a lot stronger. So fast forward to today, and the task force report that we just sent, it was like something must be done about this partisan polarization. But hopefully I've sort of shown you that the roots of this partisan polarization are very deep and very complex and have a lot to do with the mass public as well. All right, for the conclusion of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about political science and the election that is 364 days from now, even though it gets me away from the red and blue theme. But just because I figured you'd be interested in what political scientists know and don't know about the nominating process. And I will say that what we know, the list of what we know, is shorter than it was 4 years ago. So this time 4 years ago, political scientists had a pretty good handle on what predicts the nomination of a major party candidate. And the short answer was, first, the number of endorsements from elected officials from that party, and second, fundraising. Well, in 2016, when Trump became the nominee, he had the fewest endorsements of sort of the major Republicans, and although he had a lot of money himself, he had not raised a lot of money. And so Clinton in 2016 definitely conformed to that in terms of endorsement and money, but Trump did not. And so political scientists have really tried to reassess what the nomination process means in a world of easy fundraising, social media, and candidates with reality star fame. And the answers are not totally obvious. But not surprisingly, there is a record number of Democrats who are either running or were running or might be running. This list obviously keeps changing in 2019 to become the nominee in 2020. And many of these people have already dropped out. But the point is that Democrats see it as a wide open field. It's not so clear what is going to predict the nominee, and with more social media opportunities, it's less expensive to run a campaign than before, coupled with the fact that because of the congressional dysfunction that I mentioned, many candidates who might think about running for the Senate or staying in the Senate instead see serving in Congress as a less attractive option than they used to. So we have a record-setting crowd, even as some people are dropping out, among Democrats, just as there were among Republicans 4 years ago going into 2020. This map shows, this is from 270, the Democratic nominating contest states. February decides 193 delegates, Super Tuesday, 1,479. Then you go sort of through the rest of March, all the way through June. And based on endorsements and money are just no longer a particularly good guide. And frankly, the polls that we're reading are not a particularly good guide either, because today the polls are really gauging name recognition. Now, at a certain point, when voters start voting, that the name recognition will still matter. And so the polls are picking up something. But even as Joe Biden, former Vice President Biden, continues to lead in most, but not all polls, his support is very weak. And other polls by political scientists of activists, particularly those in early states, show that he's popular among many, but he's also the least popular among many others. And so, he has a high level of support, but he also scores very high on measures such as which candidate do you not want to be the presidential nominee. And so, based on past political science research, I really can't tell you who the Democratic nominee will be. The prediction models that we used to use just don't hold. Endorsements still matter, money still matters, but much less than it used to be. But I can tell you a little bit more about what political science tells us about the 2020 election. And that's with an important caveat that I don't know what everything in the impeachment inquiry will ultimately yield. Incumbent presidents are advantaged. Depending on sort of when you start counting from, it looks like, sort of 75% re-election rates, but in general, incumbent presidents are advantaged. Only a handful of swing states will determine the outcome. And the economy is very important, and it's more important than I think even journalists sort of recognize, which is to say the political science models that are typically right, that are done even 6 months before an election, factor in the economy and usually get it pretty close. Presidential popularity or lack thereof is also important. And then below these things, I would say the challenger matters. The challenger matters, but after many considerations like the economy and presidential popularity. And then the campaigns do matter, but not as much as journalists report. So sort of the gaffe of the day really doesn't matter all that much. So keep this in mind when you're following coverage of the elections. And then finally, midterm results absolutely do not predict the next presidential election. A lot of Democrats were giddy after 2018 with great results for Democrats in the House and higher turnout among Democrats than Republicans, but midterm results absolutely do not predict the next presidential elections. Just ask Bob Dole in 1996. So midterm elections don't predict them. But sadly, one thing that I think it's pretty safe to predict is that the United States will continue to be polarized, both in the mass public and in Congress, into the 2020 elections and after the 2020 elections. So anything that you can do in your own life to sort of diffuse some of this polarization, I think would be most welcome, because the U.S. was very polarized in the 1890s, 1910. We've been here before, but but to political scientists, it's alarming sort of how deep-seated and pernicious some of this polarization is. And on that happy note, I look forward to your questions.